Welcome to Missionary Stories Abroad. I'm Kim Droptini. This is episode 5. I had a cafe in Berlin. I'm going to start out the show today by telling you how Thilo Teschendorf came to join our ministry and our family. Thilo is a musician. You can find him on YouTube. He has some great songs that he wrote and an album called Back to the Father. But to go backwards, Brianna wasn't one of those who just was dying to get married all the time. She had truly given her heart to Jesus and wanted to live for him. And so if she was to get married, she wanted someone that would join in our ministry, that would join in evangelism, that would want to live as just wholeheartedly for Jesus. She had kind of was a little, what's the word, maybe a bit jaded and turned off by marriage as well because of seeing, living through my divorce, and then the church we were attending, it just seemed like there was no happy marriages, and so she was a little leery of marriage at the same time. So, but one day, this is irregardless of marriage, but one day she just said, "You know what? I feel we need a worship leader to join our team." She's because we had learned, that worship on the streets was very powerful, very effective. The Holy Spirit would come down and just draw people. They could feel something in the atmosphere. So worship was kind of like a way to pave the way, before sharing the gospel. So I thought, "She's right. Let's start praying." So we prayed for about a year that God would send us a worship leader, and I prayed not really believing it would happen, but it did. God sent us Thilo Teschendorf. When we met him, he was in a backslidden stage. He had accepted the Lord, as a young man, as a 16-year-old, he was an atheist, came from an atheistic family, and some American missionaries came to his part of East Berlin where he lived and shared Jesus with him, and he did become a Christian at 16. But after some years, he, started a rock and roll band, and he just decided to start living for himself, basically. So, unbeknownst to him, when we had met him a few times, but he came back into our lives, and, we didn't really know for sure, but he was, into some drugs. He was really just living for himself, but kinda had his foot in the Christian world and in the non-Christian world. And what's amazing is it was truly worship that brought him back to God, that turned his heart around. In worship, he realized it was like he came to his senses, saw that God was his father, and he repented. I never saw anybody turn their lives around so dramatically as Tilo did. He repented, he was rebaptized, he got rid of all the evil things that he had been involved in, and after a time, we asked him to join our ministry to the streets, and he did. He said it was a dream. He couldn't believe it. That was really what he wanted to do, and he really wanted to serve the Lord full time. And about that time, there was a, park that's real famous in Berlin. It's called the Mauer Park, and it's kind of famous because every Sunday it has a big, market, big outdoor market, and it also has within the park, it's a huge, huge park, and it also has an amphitheater, at the park, and I don't remember how we discovered it, Bree and I, but there was a young man named Christoph who had, graduated from Bible college and was wanting to plant a church, and what he did was he started in Mauer Park. He had maybe 10 friends or 10 people that came along with him, and they met at this, amphitheater, and he would stand there's a big stage and then these steps, and so they had church there on Sunday, and as we felt called to the streets as missionaries, it was right up our line, and so we started attending, but that didn't go on very long. God gave this young man a building, and he actually quit meeting at that park, and so we thought, "Let's take it up." And about that time, that was when Thilo came to us. And so every Sunday, Thilo, my son who was with us at that time, and Nate, we would go to the Mauer Park. We would have to sweep glass off of this stage because youth gathered there in the evenings and would just throw their beer bottles down from up on top of the amphitheater steps, and it would just be covered in glass. But we did this, I don't know, maybe a year. It was amazing. And what was, really amazing was every Sunday there was a karaoke, show on that at that amphitheater, and it started maybe 1 or 2 PM, and so crowds would start coming to get a space because it was huge. It was just packed out for this. So we would get some of those people coming while we're still having our church service, while we're worshiping, while we're just sharing the gospel. So it was quite amazing and what a blessing. So Tilo, he did not disappoint. He joined our team. We worshiped all over Berlin in the ensuing years. From that time, I think that was 2009 up until 2013, we worshiped all over Berlin, and, eventually Tilo fell in love with my daughter, Brianna, and they were married, on New Year's Eve of 2011. So, he still continues to be a blessing as he helps me with these shows, he helps me do the editing, and, now he's a worship leader at a church here where I live in Klamath Falls. Um, so now I'm going to switch to the cafe we had, Der Garten. I often hear in my mind, Meryl Streep saying, "I had a farm in Africa," or I think it's "Once I had a farm in Africa." Out of Africa is one of my daughter and I's favorite movies. And but I hear her say that, and I think it's because at the same time, I'm saying, kind of in that voice, "I had a cafe in Berlin," and I think about it, and I can't believe we did that, and it's really bittersweet to share the memories and the stories because we loved that time, we loved our cafe. It all started Brianna and I, as I've shared previously, we're going down to Boxhagener Park twice a week, to share with the people in the park, and we would walk home down a street called Kreutziger Avenue, and one day we're walking along and she stopped, and there was a building, and there was a sign for rent in the window. Not for a building, just for the bottom floor room. And so we peeked in the windows, and it was just a big, long, empty room. I think the floor was like a cement, the walls weren't painted, it was just big, empty room. My heart was beating. I remember when Brianna was talking about it, I knew it was her dream to have a room because Berliners are afraid of church. Number 1, I think I've shared this before as well, most of the churches are apostate. They probably sense that. But also, if you belong to the, state churches there, you have to pay taxes, and they're just turned off. They're brainwashed, they believe there's no God, they're atheists, and so they won't go t go to a church. They do now, times have changed, but back then, they wouldn't, and the idea was to have a place that wasn't a church building, but a place where they could come, and a cafe to maybe to support our ministry. That was the dream, and like I said, I was had a lot of trepidation. Could we afford this? Would this work? Could we do this? And Bree said, "Let's just call and see how much they want." They wanted, I believe it was 700 euros a month, which really wasn't bad if you're renting a building in that neighborhood for a business. So then we met with trusted, wise friends. We prayed with them. We asked counsel, should we do this? And after a lot of prayer, we decided to take that step of faith. We met with a realtor, we signed the papers, and the cafe was ours. And it was kind of like we did all that. I believe the Holy Spirit was just urging us on, but once the papers were signed, it was like, "What did we just do?" And we were required to paint the walls, we were required to make, the floor into some kind of a real floor. There was no kitchen for our cafe, so we were gonna have to put a kitchen in, even though the all the hookups were there. That's very typical in Berlin of those days. You would get an apartment with no kitchen, and you'd always have to buy a kitchen and bring it in. So, we felt overwhelmed, and the Lord spoke to us. He said, "Just take it one day at a time. Start with A, then go to B, then go to C." So A for us was buying a ladder. We knew if we were gonna paint that thing, we needed a ladder, and we've got paint, and we got some strips of wallpaper for a border. We found this really neat paint we could paint on the floor, which made it a kind of a neat, shiny, um, stained brown, which really worked, and so without putting a lot of money in, we were able to do the floor. I have a picture of us that I treasure. We only had bikes, we didn't have a car, but with that big ladder on one of our bikes and backpacks full of paint, I think we must have had to walk the bikes from the store to the room, but, that's a, uh, memory, and so we began painting. And another memory that always stands out when I think of this, because our heart was to evangelize, use this room to evangelize. And it was in the summer, it was hot, we were in there painting, it was going on towards evening, maybe 7 o'clock, and we had the front windows wide open, and all of a sudden, we heard this loud noise outside on the street, and, "What is that?" And I looked out, and it was a demonstration. They were marching up our street. There must have been hundreds, hundreds. We found out later they came even from all over England, and it was a common thing in our neighborhood. It was the people that had squatted, the empty buildings that had been left vacant when the Berlin Wall fell down, and even to that in that time, squatters were still living in those buildings. It took years and years to get them out, and the street where this cafe was had once been all squatters, every building, and over time, the owners who maybe had died, were found and and when they tried to reclaim their buildings, they couldn't get the squatters out. And so the squatters would constantly do these huge demo marches saying that they had a right, those buildings were theirs, they shouldn't be kicked out. So anyway, that's what this demo was. And here they came, and I thought, "Here we are." They're walking right past our building. So we grabbed as quick as we could as many of the little German Bibles we had, we put those out on the window, we put out Christian flyers, and, it was amazing how many, as they walked by, took flyers. Then I decided I'm just gonna stand here and talk, and I'd say, "Here, you want a Bible?" And they would take them. But there was this young man, and he was a Jew, and he told me he was from London, and he had flown there to support the squatters and be in that demo. And I offered him a New Testament, and he said, "I'm a Jew." And I said, "Well, have you ever read the New Testament?" He said, "No, I've always wanted to. I didn't know where to get a Bible." So I gave him one. I told him who we were, and, I can't remember if I prayed over him, but I knew that that night was for him. God always, gave us the one. And I kind of believe he's a Christian today because it was such an encounter and such a love encounter. And so for me, that was like just like going into Boxogner Park and God gave us Luis, the one. I felt like God sent this man to confirm, yes, you're supposed to be here in this room. And so we did have help. Some people came in and helped us paint, some friends, a young man that, one of the African guys from Nigeria, he came in and did the floor for us, and so we felt really supported. Then, we one day we were sitting there, we had met a German couple that, we worked with a little bit, and they said, "You know, I think it's time to get the refrigerator." We thought, so every financial step was hard because we were just always trying to be careful with our money, but I felt like they were telling me that, and I needed to be obedient. And so we went and looked at refrigerators and wanted to get a big one, just, big enough to hold drinks if this was gonna be a cafe, so we found one, and it was gulp, like 600 euros, but we said, "Okay, we're gonna do this in faith." The very next day after we picked out that refrigerator, a pastor, from, the group, I think I might have shared this. There was a group that came to Berlin from, South Africa, and they started a church called Every Nation, and we were friends with them and did some outreaches with them. Well, anyway, the pastor called and he said, "Hey, God told me to give this to you," and it was 600 euros. It was such a joy, such a blessing. So we got that refrigerator and, God provided. And it wasn't for quite a while later that we had to get a kitchen, but we didn't know how to do it. We didn't know how to measure. We didn't know how to do that, but this German couple, I believe God just sent them for that kitchen. The husband, measured for us, went to the store with us, helped us pick out a kitchen, and it was delivered. And then for whatever reason, that German couple walked out of our lives. I don't remember why, but he didn't stay around to help us install. So we had these boxes, we had this kitchen. We didn't know we just knew we didn't have the ability to install it. We prayed, we prayed, we prayed. One day, I got a call from another pastor in Berlin. He also had a cafe on the other side of Berlin. His name was Christian, and he, was a big help to us during that time, but out of the blue, he called and he said, "Do you need someone to install that kitchen?" And I was like, "How'd you know about that?" Turns out another friend had mentioned it to him, but he said, "I have a guy, I'll send him to you, just pay him a little bit of money and he'll install it for you." And this man came. He was a Christian, he was a blessing. He installed that whole kitchen, and so God provided. And now we had the room, we had it set up, and so during that same time period, we started becoming official. We wanted to be a charity so we could open it up as a cafe, and, it was so hard to do the paperwork, to do it all in German. It was a lot of language. Our pastor friend Christian really helped us. So, in the end, we were accepted, um, as a charity, but they would not approve that we could be for-profit charity where we could have a cafe. And that struggle went on for years, and finally, we gave it up. We just we didn't know what else to do. But as things are, we always had our vision, we always had our plans, and God always had other ideas. So we did become an official charity. It was called To the Streets, which we later called To the Streets International, and after prayer, we named our cafe Der Garten, which means the garden. We ended up trying to put a lot of plants in there. A team later on, uh, gave us a fountain to put in there, which was such a blessing. It was an American team. That fountain cost a lot of money. Bree had such a vision to have a children's corner, a place where kids could come in, and maybe moms would come in with their kids, have a cup of coffee while the kids played. Um, so we did do that, all of that, but I would say the main reason God raised up Dear Garden was for worship. It was used, I would say, most of the time for worship. At that time, the burn was starting up in Berlin, and Once a month, we had a citywide worship in there where, worship leaders from all different churches in Berlin came in, took a 2-hour, time slot, and sometimes it was a 12-hour, worship time, sometimes it was a 24-hour worship time. So about once a month, we did that. And then Thilo, had felt God told him we should worship every night for a year. We did not do weekends, but for most of a year, we worshiped every night, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So we did do that. The other things we used our cafe for was events. For example, we had teams come in, we would try to plan an event and open it up to the public. And a memorable one was we had a Brazilian team, and they made, Brazilian food, they planned Brazilian music and dances, and we advertised that to the public and had that event. We had movie nights in Berlin, um, and then one that was surprise another one of these that we didn't expect, it was just not our plan, but when at the beginning, when we were painting our cafe, we noticed this little girl, and I found out her name was Kim, which is my name, and, she would just kinda be walking the streets, and we'd think, "Where's her parents?" Well, we found out just 2 doors down from us was a bar, and the parents were in there drinking. And she would either go in the bar, come out, and so eventually she began coming into the room, and she became our adopted little girl, Kimmy. We loved her. And so when she was about and we did talk to the parents, they were very appreciative, but, we never got anywhere with them, with the gospel, and they just took it for granted, I guess, that their daughter Kimmy would come and hang out with us when their garden was open. But when she was about 5, and she had a friend at that time whose name what was her name? Germaine, her name was Germaine, and, but Germaine had a dream about Jesus, and she became a Christian, and not long after, Kimmy did too. And I remember Kimmy saying she was worried about her parents. She wanted them to become Christians, which helped me to know it was genuine, that she really came to know Jesus. Sadly, we lost touch with both of them. I can only pray that they still know the Lord today. But the other thing that happened was there was, Kurdish Muslims, many living in Berlin, that had come from the war-torn areas, and anyway, there was these beautiful children when they would look in the window at us, so eventually these Muslim kids started coming in, but when they found that we were Christians, they told us that their parents said, "You can go in there, but if they talk about Jesus, run, just go out." They never did. They pretty much just were with us. And when we had our worship nights, they were there. And I remember one particular night, one of the little girls that I particularly loved, her name was Amush, and she just it was as if the Holy Spirit came down on her, and I believe she was saved. Um, and so that was just an amazing, thing that God did, we didn't expect. We also started home church, used their garden for our home church. It was open to the public, met every Saturday or Sunday. I can't remember which days we met. We every year we had a Thanksgiving outreach there from 2009 up until 2012. It was also just open every day for people. We hoped that we evangelized on the streets could come in for coffee or tea. Um, and so that was great. The YWAM teams that continued to come, and also our dear friends Jeff and Barb, who had started the missionary uh, organization called European Initiative. They brought teams from all over the United States. So both sets of teams, if they were in town, we would they would come to our cafe to their garden, and a lot of it was just to minister in our neighborhood, which was with all the squatted people, with the drug addicts and the alcoholics. So we would use our cafe as a base and the worship. So it was an amazing time. But eventually, uh, our money started running out. And I remember one day, my daughter, we just sat down and looked at the books. We looked at our finances and we saw we couldn't go on much longer. And we were a little worried because, see, we had to give a 3-month notice before we closed the door. So we thought, what if all of a sudden we just don't have money? So we need to think about this. We did a lot of praying. Um, I think my daughter hoped that we just would push on in faith, keep going. Um, but Thilo and I felt it was time. And also, we had a dream at that time um, to travel around Europe. And I'm sorry, I'm thinking there's so much that happened. I'm kind of just, my brain's thinking, no, I tell this first, do I tell this first? But in the last year before the cafe closed, we often talked, wouldn't it be fun if we got an RV and we just traveled around Europe doing what we do, worship, share the gospel all over Europe. Uh, and also, so many missionaries came to Berlin within that 5 years that we had the cafe. We thought, there's enough, more missionaries here. Maybe we should launch out. But that seemed impossible. How could we afford an RV? But we did decide, we put our notice in that we would close the cafe. And it was so sad, so hard. But about 2 weeks after we put that notice in, a young woman who was supporting us at that time called me and said that her mother had died and she had inherited money from her mother and she wanted to tithe 10% of that money to us. And it was about what we would need to buy a small, cheap, used RV in Berlin. And we just all felt and agreed, okay, this is our next step. This is the next thing you want us to do, and which, well, I'll be telling about in the next episodes, was what we did. And also at that, we had to hand over that cafe, and to get our deposit back, we had to make the walls all white again. And that was a big job because we had painted this dark, dark purple and a green color on the walls. And it was just, and at that time, uh, Brianna and Thilo were married. They both had jobs. And so it just felt like a lot of work. But in the providence of God, he sent us a YWAM team at that time. And they were willing to not only help us paint, but they were willing to use the cafe as where they slept, on the cold cement with sleeping bags and no shower. So they would walk to our house, to my house, and shower there. But they were a great team and really, really worked hard, helped us paint that cafe. And so, we also, at the end there, we had, we opened up the cafe like as a, they call it flow marked, or as a sale. And so every day we tried to sell the furniture and the things. And it was like, even up into the end, God used it for ministry. And we thought we should have done this all along. We couldn't believe how many people came in. They would sit down, have a cup of coffee, walk around, buy things. It actually was kind of fun. We made some money and we shared the gospel at the last days of our cafe. And so one day we handed in the keys and it was closed. But I don't believe it was closed for eternity. And one day, years before this, my daughter and I, we were on vacation actually in Taiwan, visiting my son. And we both had an identical dream on the same night. And the dream was, I said, Brie, I had this dream. And in the dream, there was our cafe, and it was packed with people. And it was so full that the overflow had to go into my apartment and into her apartment. And I told her the dream, and she said, I had the same dream. I was shocked. I couldn't believe she had the same dream. And from that time on, we believed, okay, this is going to happen. But it never happened. And in the months as we were going to close the cafe, I would ponder on that dream and kind of think, oh, what, either Satan gave us that dream. I don't know. We heard God wrong. I would think about it. And I'll never forget, one day you could walk to their garden from my house. It was an easy walk. And I was walking there, and there's a main street you have to cross, Frankfurter Allee. And I remember waiting at the light to cross that street. And I remember, because this was so vivid, I walked and I was about halfway across, and God spoke to me. And he said, that dream you had? That dream will have, the fulfillment of it is for the millennial reign. When I'm reigning from Jerusalem, your cafe will be reopened. And that vision was for the millennium. And I was like, oh, it was as if light bulbs went off. I never forgot it. And just today, actually, while I was preparing for this podcast, in the morning when I was doing my devotional, I happened to be reading a book by Randy Alcorn called Heaven. And in that book, Randy Alcorn believes, well, can I just tell you what he said? He believes in the millennial reign, and that things we had done on earth, such as a ministry or any work we have done, will be restored on the new earth, in the new heaven. And many scholars believe this, not just Randy Alcorn. And he says that just as the fire of God's judgment will destroy wood, hay, or straw, yet it will purify gold, silver, and costly stones, which will survive the fire. And that's it. That's from 1 Corinthians 3:12-5. And it's kind of referring to our lives, what we have done, works that we did in the flesh, we didn't do to glorify God, will be burned up, but the good works will be carried over. And so Randy Alcorn believes that those purified works on the earth must surely include the products of human culture. And so what a blessing to read that just this morning. And I felt a prompting from the Lord to share that with you, that get the book, Randy Alcorn, Heaven. It's so good. But in that initial vision that God gave me in Berlin, I saw Jesus reigning from his throne in Jerusalem. And I saw it like, I don't know how we travel in the millennial reign, but it seems easy. I saw myself in Jerusalem coming to Berlin and somehow having an authority and having this cafe reopened. And so I just think that's something to look forward to. It's very hopeful. And I want to close with this. It kind of touches on Catholicism. The team that helped us paint that cafe were going on to Prague for their second part of their phase of their mission outreach. And for whatever reason, the leader decided to invite me along. He said, you know what? Why don't you come with us to Prague? We would love to have you. And so I prayed about it and went to Prague with them for 10 days. I remember we stayed in a hostel. One of the hostels we stayed in had bed bugs. We were all getting bitten. And luckily, when we reported it, they put us in another room. But it turned out to be kind of a life-changing in my thinking and in my education, what I learned about Catholicism. It was like light bulbs went off from that time to this. We worked with a missionary group in Prague that was with Youth of the Mission. And the man was older. And one day he took us on a walking tour of Prague, and he took us to a church that stands there. It's called the Bethlehem Chapel, and it was built in the late 1300s. And there's a well there that is, it's closed, of course, but it was used for the town. The town would come draw water from that well, and then there was a church. And it's amazing that you can go there. Of course, it's been refurbished, but still there. And he sat us down and he told us the story of Jan Hus, who preached 100 years before Martin Luther. I had never heard this story before. There's a big statue of Jan Hus in a public square near that church in Prague. And I'm just going to kind of read. I wrote, when that man shared it, I wrote it in my diary, and I'm just going to kind of look at this and share this as I share it with you. Jan Hus preached. Well, let me jump down here. Let's see. Okay. The gospel was given to Jerome of Prague by John Wycliffe in Oxford. Isn't that cool? Wycliffe had discovered the truth of Jesus and gave the teaching to Jerome, who gave the teaching to Jan Hus. And the teaching was that we're saved through Christ alone, through grace alone, not by any work, which was and is taught by the Catholic Church at that time. And at that time, there, just Catholicism. They taught on salvation in Jesus. And so Jan Hus came and preached the truth of the gospel to thousands in Prague. So many that eventually the Catholics became angry, because when they became Christians, they weren't under the control of the Catholics any longer. They realized they didn't have to pay, they didn't have to do penance, they didn't have to do all these different things to earn their salvation. And they burned Jan Hus at the stake. And they continued to burn Christians. There's a monument in the same square in Prague where Jan Hus is. And if you look on the ground, there's crosses all over. I think there's 20 crosses. And then there's this high tower. Well, they threw reformers out of the window of that tower. And there's a cross for each one. And they eventually successfully turned. At that time, Czech was 90% Protestant or Christian, but after killing so many, that they eventually turned the country to Catholicism. And when Jan Hus was burned at the stake, he prophesied, "Today you burn this goose. In 100 years, a swan will arise out of the ashes, and you will not stop him." And 100 years later, Martin Luther came on the scene, and he was unstoppable. So let's see. It says, back to my notes, they took the teachings of Jan Hus, reproduced them, and sent them all over Czechoslovakia. That's how it became 90% Protestant. And then an army was formed to defend themselves from the Catholics. They fought for 200 years, and Catholicism won. 200 years. They were exiled to Germany, where the prayer movement started from the Moravians, which a lot of you know about. Jan Hus wrote hundreds of hymns and was very prophetic. And so anyway, when I heard this story and I saw those crosses and imagined that 200-year war, I also then started looking into John Wycliffe and saw how in England, the Catholics would go from house to house. And if they found a Bible, they would maybe kill the husband of the family. They would find children and see if they could quote from the Bible. If they could, they would arrest the family. And then I saw this story, fighting for 200 years. And all of a sudden, it was like light bulbs went off. And please don't hear me wrong. I know there are Catholics, there are Christians. I know many Catholics that are Christians. So I'm not saying you can't be a Catholic and not be a Christian. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm talking about the upper echelons of Catholicism, what they believe, the religion itself. I believe, and I just firmly believe this, it was founded by Satan himself to stop people from knowing about Christ alone and grace alone. And all over Europe, when I evangelized, almost every atheist I met had been raised Catholic. And because of the Catholic Church, and even into our time with all the priests molesting, they're not Christians because of Catholicism. And your average Jew, they don't understand there's a difference between Catholicism and Christianity. They think all Christians, they think all of us in the United States are Catholic. That's all they know of Christianity. And the average Jew, if they read the Bible, they are shocked to find this is a Jewish book. All they know is that Catholics hated Jews. And so anyway, it just all these light bulbs went off, how Satan had used Catholicism, the popes, to block a true biblical Jesus Christ truth from the masses. And still, I believe to this day. And I think it's really sad. But as I said, I know there's many Catholics that love Jesus, that know the truth, that know about grace. But anyway, that was just monumental in my life that I learned all that. I got to go to Prague with this YWAM team. And so I began in evangelizing. If I found out there was Catholicism, I tried to explain. It's not through Mary. And you don't call your priest father. There's only one Father, your Father God in heaven. So God just uses everything, doesn't he, in our lives? So thank you so much for listening to Missionary Stories Abroad and my stories of our beloved cafe that will one day be resurrected in the millennial reign, I believe. Thank you for listening. May God bless you.